Okay, we're going to be making a half square triangle. We have our two pieces in contrasting colors, 6 inches square. I'm going to take the lighter color, and on the wrong side we're going to draw a line in pencil from corner to corner. Now put these two pieces right sides together, and because they're fairly large, I'm just going to put a pin in either side just to keep them from slipping as we're sewing them. We are now going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of this line, so a 1/4 inch going down this way, and then when you get to the end, just turn it around without having to cut the thread, and sew a 1/4 inch along that side. Now that my seams are sewn on either side of that pencil line, we're going to take our ruler, and right along that pencil line we are going to cut the two pieces into two separate pieces. And this is called a half square triangle because we have a square that's been cut in half and creating a triangle. Now that we have them separated, we're going to press them open. Again, pressing the seam towards the dark, but because that seam is sewn on the bias, we want to be careful not to stretch that out as we're pressing. So I'm going to just gently tap it in place a little bit to get it ready for pressing. And same with this other piece. Again, just open it up towards the dark and gently pat it in place just to get that seam to line the direction we want to get ready for pressing. We're now going to trim these blocks down to 5 inches. Because it's a total, just an even square, you could actually just line this up and cut it once down to 5 inches, but I prefer to do 2 cuts, so I'm going to start at 5.5 from each side. So I've got my diagonal line lining up with my seam and 5.5 inches on each edge of the fabric. I do this for a couple of reasons. Number one, to create a habit, because sometimes you have blocks that need to be trimmed twice, because if you trim it only once, you might be trimming off part of the design, and therefore you won't end up with a square. So by creating this habit, it's easier to get this done. And secondly, sometimes even here you can see that the fabric is not totally even when it's sticking out from the edge there. So by doing it twice, the other side might not be perfectly even. So by doing it twice, I'm going to make sure that this side is perfectly square and straight, and then turn it, and the other side will also be perfectly square and straight. And this also is going to be cutting off the dog ears as we're going. So now I'm going to turn it, and now line this up to a 5-inch square. Now we go down to 5 inches. Again, I'm lining this up. My diagonal is on the seam line, 5 inches and 5 inches. And now I'm going to trim the rest off. And we have our 5-inch square. Okay, the next step was to make our strip set. We take the two strips that have been cut and sew them together, right sides together, and of course press the seam towards the dark. We're going to be cutting these into subcutting into smaller pieces, but I just want to start out by trimming the end to make it even, because you can see either end is probably not going to match up perfectly, so I'm just going to take my ruler and just trim off part of it to make it nice and straight. To make sure I have a nice straight edge to begin with. Now, because I'm right-handed, I'm going to just turn this around and cut from the other side. We're subcutting into 3-inch pieces. So I've got my fabrics lined up on that line and this line, and now I know when I cut this, I'm going to have a nice straight cut. And we'll end up with 4 pieces. One. And you can line up your lines on the edge of the fabric or the ruler if you like, whatever makes you comfortable to get the accurate result that you need. That's 2. Three. And you'll see that there's a little bit of a strip that's going to be left over, so that because there's enough room in your 12.5 strip to make sure that you've got your perfect 3-inch subcuts. Now we have 4 pieces. Now we're going to make 4 patches. So those 2 are going to be sewn together in that fashion, and these 2 will be sewn together. And because your seams have already been pressed towards the dark, they're going to match up. They're going to nest very easily. So go ahead and sew those pieces together. Okay, this has been sewn and pressed, and the seam can be pressed in either direction. We are now going to trim these blocks down to 5 inches as well. So we're going to start with 2.5 inches. And to line this up, I'm going to find my 2.5 inch mark along the diagonal, and I'm going to place that in the center. And you can see that all these other lines are going to line up. So now I've got that lined up satisfactorily. I'm now going to trim this outside edge, both the top and the side. It's awkward sometimes cutting that other edge. Now we're going to turn the block and do the same thing again, and my 2.5 inch line is going to be lining it up in there, and I still have more to trim off. This is where you can see that if I'm going to show you the other block. This is being trimmed down to 5 inches, so if I had just put this down onto 5 inches to trim it. Okay, so I've got my line up here and line up there, so I'm going to trim off that amount of fabric. And even through the ruler you can see that I no longer have a square. These 2 have been cut down and they're no longer square. So this is why we trim one side and then turn it and then trim the other side. So I'm just going to now finish trimming this one. Again, marking 2.5 inches in the center, and my lines here and there are lining up, and I'm going to trim the side. And now we have a 5 inch block. And my cutter needs to be trimmed. There's my 5 inch block. This process of making small blocks and putting them together to make one larger block is very, very typical of patchwork quilting. So now that we have our 4 little blocks, we are going to lay them out to make our Irish chain. These 2 blocks are going to go end to end, like that, to make the chain, and these 2 are going to fill that in, and now you can see that that's how they're going to be laid out, and here is your chain. So now we are going to sew these 2 pieces together and sew those 2 pieces together. Okay, these 2 pieces have been sewn together, and some of these, and I've pressed the seams in opposite directions. This I pressed towards that way because there's more dark there, and that one has gone in the other direction. So now I'm going to sew these together and then press the final seam in either direction, and the block is finished.